Thank you so much for that introduction. I am so happy to be with you all. I really want to extend my sincere apologies for the time misunderstanding, the time zone misunderstanding. It's very generous to have been invited here, and I'm very looking forward to sharing this space with you and hearing all of these excellent presentations, of course, that help us to envision a world beyond the carceral state, which of course brings me to the subject of my of the talk that I've delivered for today, which I'm really centering around what does it mean to work to abolish the carceral state. So I'll open with the question, why are we so afraid of abolishing the carceral state? Now, I'm using the term we facetiously to attend to the violent inclusion and exclusion of the term we, from which, of course, myself as a Black feminist and radical and so many others are cast out of this we. But we could re-ask this question, why are we so afraid of a world without police and a world without policing? Of course, understanding that policing takes place across state institutions much more broadly than law enforcement. Now, these are not new questions. The words of June Jordan from decades ago now says, "A nation of violence and private property has every reason to dread the violated and the deprived." In a society that is organized around meeting what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment, not with care, but with carceral controls. We need to understand that fashioning the opposite of a carceral society is a care-based society. Now, I would say that now I'll use this term more expansively to say that we are perhaps less afraid than we have been in several decades in North American societies. I remember being, for example, at a police abolition conference in January that was organized by Rachel Herzig, by Andrea Ritchie, in which we were making jokes about how perhaps one day we would see the words "abolish the police" in mainstream conversations. Little did we know that, of course, in 6 months that would be a call that would be spread across the world, not only within radical circles, not only within Black radical intellectual traditions, but spanning society at large. It was unimaginable at that time what may have come next. But as Cedric J. Robinson has written, the first attack is an attack on the culture. Now, he's using this to describe a two-pronged reality, of course, in which, of course, the colonizer, the slave master, attacks the cultures of the oppressed, but he is also using that, and this is what I'll be thinking with us more expansively today, is that the first attack by the oppressed is also on the culture, on the epistemic realities of the taken for granted of any given society. And you can see a significant attack on our end on the given culture, as we see in the wake of the police lynching of George Floyd, the historic street-based protests across North America and the world, the challenging of the monuments to racial violence, including statues to slavers, as well as police stations, that the culture of prevailing racism and carceral controls, with Black people in particular being subject to what Gilmore calls racially delineated proximity to death, that's a paraphrase, that of course we see a challenge to police killings. There are so few changes in our lives and deaths since many of us were out protesting the killings of Trayvon Martin, of Andrew Loku, of Bonnie Jean-Pierre, but we are also witnessing a rejection of the broader racial and structural logics of our time, in particular around the structure of the carceral state and all of its racial and gendered implications. Of course, COVID has put pressure on these logics by exposing the failures of the presumed statement, we, again, are all in this together, of this being a great equalizer. We see now people continuing, albeit under less media attention, protesting police violence, but it's, well, the broader politic of disposability of who has been allowed to live and die. In Toronto, the city where I live, for example, 83% of COVID infections have been people who are Black or racialized. In Montreal, it's very concentrated in Montréal-Nord, which is a neighborhood populated largely by Haitian and Black West African peoples, in Black agricultural workers and domestic workers and care workers. And yet we are in unimaginable times of protest and revolt, a time of historic Black-led revolt in particular, where the world had stopped for many, but for the carceral state, it had only ramped up. In Toronto, or in Canada, we saw the police killings had almost doubled in the first 6 months of the pandemic, of Indigenous teenager Aisha Hudson, who was killed by the police in Winnipeg, of DeAndre Campbell, a Black man who was killed in the context of a mental health crisis, of Regis Korsinski-Paquet, a Black woman who fell several stories to her death in the context, again, of a police, of a mental health crisis that could have and should have been met with care. In this present moment of struggle under the rubric defund the police, we are actually seeing a more profound challenge to the carceral state itself. And this is both at the level of an epistemic challenge as well as a structural challenge. This is historic not only in the numbers of people who are out in the streets in this moment, but in the complex level of political analysis of this time, where we've seen this massive crescendo of protest showing that not only has the state supposedly failed us, but in fact, the state has been, as it has been historically developed as a carceral and racializing regime, is functioning precisely as one might imagine in the context of a crisis, distributing violence according to racial, gendered, and logics, as well as those of ability, as well as those of sex working and drug using people in the form of racialized and gendered surveillance, captivity, and control. So as we can see, much of the protest against these dominating logics and structures has coalesced around the demand to defund the police. In Canada, over several weeks in the summer, there were more than 70 defunding related events that had taken place just in that brief period of time. The broader question being asked, which is the epistemic challenge, is what is the nature of safety? Who keeps us safe? That has exposed the reality that police in prisons, including migrant prisons, while framed under the rubric of public safety, are in fact in service of the opposite. That for Black peoples, for Indigenous peoples especially, that anybody who is not a property owning upper middle class person, people living on or near the streets, people using substances, migrants, the police are more accurately described as a site of violence. That policing in prisons, again, are forms of violence in our society, not working in the service of violence prevention. While this is something that Black radicals from incarcerated sites, including George Jackson and Assata Shakur and many others have been articulating, again, from the Black incarcerated radical tradition for generations, we see this as something that is now being more broadly understood in the present moment. The notion that police broadly combat dangerous situations requiring force is a myth. A Statistics Canada report estimated that up to 80% of police responses to calls in Canada were related to issues like mental health, drug overdose, suicide, domestic dispute, and violence, all of these issues that policing, of course, only in fact escalates and makes worse. We're witnessing also a historic questioning of the role of the policing, the connections in North America to slave patrols, to the criminalizing of Blackness through runaway slave ads, the past system of Indigenous, which controlled the movements of Indigenous peoples who were not supposed to leave reservations that they had been forced onto without permission, is all the genealogy of policing, and again, reinforcing the racial and economic violence of the carceral state. Now, again, I want to just briefly highlight that there are often gendered aspects of this that are forgotten that actually help us to understand what carceral control looks like more broadly. If we understand that in post-slavery societies, laws surrounding sexual deviance, for example, a trait attributed inexorably to Black womanhood, have been used to control the movement of Black women in public space across geographic locations spanning centuries. But if we allow ourselves again to turn to the realities of alternative realities of racialized policing, as Black feminists have encouraged us to do, we can identify the white home, the domestic enslavement of Black women as among the earlier sites of racialized surveillance over Black life. That also demonstrate, which refuse to dismiss or marginalize the significant harms that persist under relative obscurity within the so-called private realm. Black feminists in particular ask us to understand that if we look to Black women's realities, we see that the distinctions between public and private are in fact obscured, given the monstrous forms of abuse and violence that drastically exceed the policing of movements through public space. So if we look to the ways that this has moved forward in our society, we understand that, of course, while Black women are victims of police violence and police killings and incarceration, poor Black women's lives especially ask us to understand state violence and the carceral regime as extending well beyond criminal justice, looking to the multi-sided surveillance within the child welfare system, in which Black women are surveilled, in which Black children are apprehended en masse and placed in so-called state care, which is of course yet another obscured site of violence. What this tells us is that abolition too must be multi-sided. It points us to the abolition that extends well beyond particularly law enforcement and incarceration, and asks us to look to other locations, including schools, including child welfare, as places of racialized and gendered carceral surveillance and control. As Mariame Kaba has argued very lucidly, many things that are criminalized are not harmful, and many things that are harmful are not criminal. So if we understand policing as not about ending harm, but about combating an ideological construct that is called crime, an ideological construct in the service of racial carceral colonial capitalism. Therese Burden-Stelle has argued that capitalism is both a racial and anti-Black economic system, that anti-Blackness has a material basis, and the political economy that grew out of slavery maintains some of the most enduring logics of Black non-humanity. Racial capitalism is undergirded by an anti-Blackness that is material, that is enforced by police, as well as by the prison system and the broader carceral state. If we think about policing as the foot soldiers of racial capitalism, we can understand again this retrenchment into the broader system, in which Ruthie Gilmore writes, the capacity to kill is a precondition for the capacity to incarcerate. Now, I think I just wanted to briefly turn to the fact that many of the challenges to the carceral state that we are witnessing from this past summer follow the tradition of the ways in which challenges to the carceral state have continuously been forged, which is from those who are actually subject to the carceral state, who are most abandoned by anything that we could call care in this society. The places that literally shorten people's lives, jails and prisons, are sites of enormous psychological and physical violence that, as Angela Davis notes, disappear people. And yet this is also a site of enormous intellectual challenges and political challenges to the status quo. What Joy James calls incarcerated intellectuals have been at the forefront of developing the logics of our time. Nearly 1 year ago today, largely Black migrants in a migrant prison in Laval, Quebec, which is in Canada, went on hunger strike, risking their lives, their health, risking organ failure and permanent physical damage in order to secure not only their release in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and their exposure, but those of others, demanding status for all, demanding release of all detainees. We often think about the spring and summer as the time that the protest against perhaps the most mediatized protest against the enduring racial and gendered violences of the carceral state at our time, but it's important to remember that this trajectory began behind bars in March. So in response to this migrant strike, the hunger strike, we saw other prisoners, for example, from Burnside Prison, Nova Scotia, Black prisoners writing in support of these hunger strikers, linking together that all incarceration is always already a site of violence, but in particular these times. If we look towards the summer, in the words of Black federally incarcerated prisoners, as dictated to L. Jones, published in the Halifax Examiner, we have them saying, we join the calls to defund the police, and we say it is time to defund the prison. Canadians should ask themselves why so many Black and Indigenous people are incarcerated. You should ask yourselves why your money is going to a system that doesn't work to solve crime. You should ask why a prison is being built in your community and whether it will actually make your life better. What this shows us, of course, is that policing, again, is not in a vacuum, and neither is prison or migrant detention, nor the mass removal of children in child apprehension, which is why abolition has been so crucially articulated as the abolition of the prison industrial complex. Now, I've spoken a bit of this attack on the culture, to think with Robinson about the massive shifts in the broader public's understanding of the function of policing versus the real function, of the function of prisons and the carceral state versus their perceived function, and also drawn attention to the fact that while this has appeared to come out of nowhere, it has of course been articulated by people behind bars and is related to traditions of Black revolt and Black radicalism that span centuries, that are related, of course, to the original revolt against captivity under slavery. And yet it's helpful for us I'm going to just repeat that the defunding movement can be understood as an epistemic attack on the carceral state, but it is also one that is structural, one that is chipping away at the most carceral elements of the state while pushing to refashion non-carceral futures. Now, I only have a few minutes remaining, but I think it's time. I would just like to quickly turn towards what those structural challenges are, because it's not only, while a very substantive and important element has been the epistemic challenge to the carceral state, that the structural challenges being forwarded are crucial for us to think about what this means. Because defunding the police is about seriously and genuinely committing ourselves to safety in our communities, about finding alternatives of community supports and safety that are not rooted in surveillance and punishment of our communities. So if we look towards some of the main strategies that we are seeing across North America, for example, the decoupling of police from schools, where we've seen the presence, and the decoupling of police from other institutions where they have no, where there is no moral claim for them to be. Now, of course, I would argue, and many would argue, that this is our entire society, but we do see an attack on removing police from some of the most harmful places. So that looks like decoupling police from schools, decoupling police from mental health response, particularly in context of the deaths in Canada of DeAndre Campbell, Regis Porchinski-Paquet, and a long line of other Black peoples in particular who have lost their lives at the hands of police in the context of so-called mental health response. Chipping again away at the carceral state is a push to end the criminalization of poverty, and of course, which of course is attached to the corollary demand of ending the kind of economy that would force people to poverty in the first place. But if policing criminalizes poverty because Black and Indigenous people are so overrepresented in terms of homeless populations, and yet continue to be criminalized vis-a-vis bylaw infractions, that does nothing to address poverty, but again, only retrenches it along racial, gendered, and economic lines. The movement to hashtag defund the police is part of a broader abolitionist struggle that is related to and necessarily part of efforts to defund and dismantle immigration detention, jails, prisons, forced psychiatrization, and migration controls more broadly. So again, I would ask us to conclude, why are we so afraid of a world without police and policing? I would restate June Jordan's words: a nation of violence and private property has every reason to dread the violated and the deprived, and remind us that what is currently underway, the challenge to the carceral state more broadly, is a struggle in the service of broader human liberation, not precisely only about Black liberation, though of course this is central to the historic iterations of the demand. I'll bring in other words of June Jordan again to highlight this. I can't think of a single supposedly, this is her words, I can't think of a single supposedly Black issue that hasn't wasted the original Black target group and then spread like the measles to outlying white experiences. If slavery was all right, for example, if state violence and the law could protect property rights against people, then the boss man could call out the state against striking white workers, and he did. And nobody bothered to track the diseased idea of the state back to the first victims, Black people. This is from June Jordan's Problems of Language in a Democratic State. Now, policing is one example of this, but the carceral state more broadly, we see Black people as what Sexton calls the prototypical target of the broader criminalizing regime. So again, to highlight that, of course, this challenge to the carceral state is not only in the service of Black liberation, of Indigenous liberation, but it is in the service of human liberation. And we see examples of what it means to live beyond and outside of the police state in small examples all the time, especially by those who have been cast outside the epistemic understandings of who is considered the public who should be safe, and those who have been abandoned by the economies of racial capitalism. For example, I've spent many years working at organizations working with people, with sex working people, with Black sex workers who, cast outside of illicit and formal economies, criminalized, nonetheless supported one another, which is not to romanticize away the violence caused by criminalization, of course, which vastly outpaces those in more licit economies, but the real material ways of support that we see in communities that have had no access to police so-called protections. We see that safety is always being made by people outside the purview of the state's so-called safety. So I would just end again by saying that the opposite of the carceral state is a care-based society, and that we see evidence of this every day especially by and with those most subjected to organized abandonment. I suppose I'll end there, just really reiterating again that the end of racial colonial capitalism, the end of all carceral structures, is also the beginning of a new world where real safety was no longer a pipe dream, but was something that we could imagine being actualized at the level of the local as well as at the level of the global. Thank you.